I want to welcome to the show Dr. Elizabeth Stevens. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited about this conversation. It's a hard one. We're talking about trauma, and you have a book out called Unshackled. And you're not just writing this from a professional experience, you're also writing this from a very personal place. I would love just to start off with hearing about your story with trauma, and let's go from there.
Okay, sure. So I sustained a traumatic brain injury in 2015. I had trauma before that, but I didn't acknowledge it as trauma until I had that life-threatening situation that really crushed me. So it was a traumatic brain injury. Within a month of that, I was raped. And it was just the combination of those two that was something that I could not push through. I could not get past, and it just hit a breaking point. And so it was a long struggle of healing and trying to get my life back over a 3-year period. I couldn't read without getting an intense migraine, couldn't work. It was just a very difficult time where I was utterly broken and I felt it and through my soul. And so it was that time where I actually really found a deeper soul healing that I didn't know I needed. And I was able to actually be honest with myself and really find an amazing amount of freedom.
Can you talk to us about that healing and what that means for you? And I know I put this in the introduction, but you're a psychiatrist.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes when we hear about medical professionals, myself included, people can think that we have it all together and that we're immune to mental health challenges. And so I'm curious what it was like for you as a professional to have your brain injury and not to be able to read, or you write about in the book, not even being able to watch TV.
Right. As an overachiever, someone who's really goal oriented, doing everything I can to get through medical school, residency, joining the Air Force, becoming an officer, all of those kind of things. That was a large part of my identity, and I didn't realize it until it was pretty much stripped from me and I couldn't even read, I couldn't perform. Treating people with trauma is a lot different than going through the trauma at a personal level. And so it was it was very eye-opening to me, like what actually works clinically, what doesn't work. And it really helped me as a clinician to know to treat each person as an individual and not try to put them in a box and say, oh, well, this is supposed to work, so this is what we're going to do. And really
Mm-hmm.
listen to the patient. Listen to the
Mm-hmm.
patient if something's not working, if they're having a side effect to a medication, truly listen to them and not say, oh, well, that shouldn't happen, therefore just deal with it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was very eye-opening for me to truly understand what it feels like to hit that breaking point to where I can't just push through it. I can't just do this therapy, everything's good. It's really a long drawn out process of healing. I mean, it's a lifelong process of healing and peeling that onion. And once you get through one layer, it's diving into the next layer and it's difficult. It's really tough work. I didn't realize how difficult it was until I had to go through it myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you feel like I hate to say like the hardest thing, but what do you feel like was the most eye-opening thing coming at it from a patient perspective versus maybe that provider perspective?
I think it's the isolation and not feeling seen and not feeling heard.
Yeah.
And so it was this traumatic brain injuries, trauma, PTSD, a lot of that is you can't see it. It's you don't take a blood test and say, "Oh, well, your levels are good, you're good to go." There's a lot of subjective symptoms going on, and if the clinician doesn't value, respect, or truly listen and take that time, which a lot of clinicians don't have the time to take,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not going to get the treatment you need. You're going to feel dismissed. And I went to a point where like I don't want to go to another provider because I'm going to hear the same thing. And Some even ask me what medications I feel like I need to take. I'm like, you're the physician
Yeah.
for me. I'm
Yeah.
not working right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very interesting dynamic because they knew I was a physician, and they it wasn't what it should be. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't what I intend a psychiatrist or a physician to how to treat people and really see them as a human being, and really so it was that disconnect, feeling like another number, feeling like
Mm-hmm.
um, well, I should be healed by now. That's what they're telling me. I've had, 4 concussions within 6 months, and it was really difficult for me to not feel heard and understood. And on the other side of that, it was really not having that community who understood what I was going through, because number one, I didn't want to talk to everybody about it. And number two, a lot of people were in that same situation that I was in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just that you don't feel like you have a place where you can truly turn to be understood and really be heard.
Yeah. The first part, what you're describing to me is medical gaslighting. I know it's gonna happen. He's gonna come in, they're gonna be quiet down. What you're describing is medical gaslighting, and I hear that a lot with my clients, and I've experienced that myself. I'm curious, what would you recommend for people who are going through that? What can they do to be more heard and seen? Because it can feel very discouraging, disappointing, defeating to not feel safe with a physician, where we should feel safe and we should feel heard. What can we do?
Not every physician that treated me was like that. There were some really
Right.
awesome people, but I think I could have definitely been more vocal of saying, I don't feel like you're listening to me right now with the symptoms that I'm going through. I think truly think that they would listen to that, and that would
Mm,
kind of help them understand how they are approaching the patient. And it's really easy. I mean, I was getting into that space prior to my brain injury, where you see patient after patient after patient, and you start getting callous because you're seeing all this trauma, you're seeing all of these horrible things, and you have to put a shell up at some point to where, yes, this is a patient, but you don't have that ability to empathize because you put that barrier up.
mm-hmm.
And so if someone is acknowledging, hey, I'm not feeling heard right now, this is what I'm really going through, these are the symptoms, this is real for me, then I think I'm hoping the physician would rethink how they're approaching the situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it can definitely be re-traumatizing, and it's sad whenever people don't get the help that they need. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, we hear the word trauma and little t trauma, big T trauma, there's a lot of talk about trauma. How would you define what trauma is, and even what PTSD is? Because I think there's a lot of bad definitions out there, and it can feel
Mm-hmm.
confusing of, is this really trauma? Because we can minimize what we're going through, but talk to us about what trauma is and maybe what it's not.
All right. So from a clinical perspective, with the DSM-5, the manual that we use, psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists will use, it defines trauma as a life-threatening situation or a sexual trauma. And so it could either be having that firsthand, being an eyewitness, with first responders and dispatch. It could be hearing the story over the phone. And so that trauma is defined as life and death. And so you have to meet that criteria, or the sexual trauma, to meet the criteria for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma in a broader sense. So we can experience micro traumas every day, where
Mm-hmm.
we're driving and we see a car coming and we think we might be hit or T-boned in a split second, and we don't even realize our brain's processing that at the time. That could be a potential life-threatening situation, but we haven't processed through that.
Right.
So there could be multiple things throughout the day that we're not acknowledging as could be a potential life-threatening situation. Didn't necessarily happen, but they can be kind of micro traumas.
Mhm.
There can be an even broader sense where my system is overwhelmed and I don't know how to process the situation and I'm not equipped to deal with it. And so that can be a broader sense of trauma. So
Mhm.
if you're talking from clinical perspective, yes, it has to fit a specific mold, but there can be broader sense of traumas in experience in everybody's life on a daily basis.
Yeah. And would you also say that maybe not from a clinical perspective, but maybe just from a way of understanding ourselves and understanding our responses, that trauma could then lead to PTSD, even though it may not meet that criteria, just from a way of framing like, wow, that this is really hard for me and this is triggering for me. And so I'm having a response to this stimuli or whatever.
And I think that's why people are moving to talk about more post-traumatic stress and not having the D on there,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's not the clinical diagnosis, it's not that clinical specific diagnosis, but it's a real thing in people's lives where they're dealing, it could be a child whose parents got divorced and they're overwhelmed by that situation. They don't know how to deal with that situation. It's not life threatening, but it definitely changes their life. And so they can have a difficulty overcoming that for decades to come, or maybe not ever overcoming that until they deal with it.
Mm-hmm. My next question is how does denial impact the process? But even as we're talking, I think whenever we don't know how to define things, or when we feel like, no, it's really not that disorder, that can lead to our denial. So I'm curious, like, how does denial impact the process, both for for you personally and professionally? What are you seeing?
Mhm. I think it's one of the biggest barriers to growth and to healing.
Hmm.
I was very much a person who would stuff things down, move on, not deal with them because I didn't want to see flaws, failures, vulnerabilities in myself because I had a mission to do. I had goals to achieve. And so up until the traumatic brain injury, that was my MO. I would just push things down and just ignore them. I
Mm.
don't know if I truly knew that I was doing that, but it was that negative coping mechanism that I was doing to continue to push to my goals. And so I think um, with with a lot of people in society, just those type A's, or even people who are in, well, the human condition, right?
Hmm.
It's just that desire to, well, I have, I have a perspective that I want to display to the world. I want people to see me this way. I want to see
Hmm.
myself this way. Therefore, I'm going to try my best to hide whatever I don't want people to see and whatever
Mm.
I don't want to see. And so when it comes to trauma, it makes it even worse because there's lies that we end up believing about the world or ourselves. We don't end up not trusting in God or trusting ourselves or trusting other people. And so we end up in this isolation. And so
Mhm.
I think if trauma or if something is not acknowledged, it's never going to be dealt with. And so that's pretty much
Mm.
the first step to any kind of healing is acknowledging it and breaking the power of denial.
Mhm. What are the different forms of denial? You mentioned stuffing it, but I know there's lots of different ways that can manifest. And I think it's also important to note that just because we deny something doesn't mean that we're intentionally denying it. You talk
Right.
about that, how you didn't know that you were denying it. It's so subtle.
hmm There, there can be basically any distraction that we use in order to prevent ourselves from dealing with the real issue is a form of denial.
Mm.
I also personally, because I had the traumatic brain injury and then I had that secondary trauma right on top of it, I believe my body was trying to protect me um, to continue to heal. And so there can be a healthy, and I talk a little bit about it in my
Yeah.
book, a healthy form of denial where your body sometimes, if you're in a traumatic situation, can go into shock, where it just kind of shuts down. And if I truly believed or saw the extent of the sexual trauma on top of the traumatic brain injury when I couldn't really even find my words, and my brain wasn't functioning well, that would have sent me over the edge. And so there was this period of time where it was probably good. But after a while, I mean, 2.5 years is a little too long to continue to push that down and not even acknowledge it's there.
Mm.
And so using, whether it's distractions of, well, I'm going to find another goal, or using my traumatic brain injury as this is my only problem, I don't have anything else going on, that can be a form of denial where you're so fixated or focused on one thing and you're ignoring all the others.
Mm-hmm. Would you also say that numbing is another form of denial?
Oh, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Numbing, and within military first responders, so I have a nonprofit called Advancing Warriors, and we really help build out support groups and community for veterans and first responders. And a lot of that population, I mean, military alcohol is huge within the military. And then when people get off shift, firefighters, police officers, they go to alcohol, and that's a major numbing agent. And so it's just those forms of numbing, whether it's in the book, it could be any kind of addiction is a numbing agent. So you don't have to deal with the bigger issues going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I want to say to the listener who is struggling with addiction, it can feel so overwhelming to both deal with the addiction and to deal with the trauma. But just know that you're not a bad person. What you're doing is there's a reason for it. And I think that's one of the powerful things about therapy is talking about those things and bringing them into the light in a very safe space, and to have curiosity around our behaviors versus feeling shame.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. You write about different barriers in the healing process when it comes to trauma. A spiritual barrier, relational barrier, societal barrier, and physical barrier, and a psychological barrier. Talk to us a little bit about those barriers, and what do we need to look out for, and what are some helpful ways for us to not only cope with our trauma, but also to begin the healing process.
So the barriers are anything that's holding us back from that freedom, anything that's holding us back from healing. And for a lot of people, it's easy to focus on, if, like for me, I've focused on the physical, the traumatic brain injury, and ignored the psychological piece, even though I'm a psychiatrist. It's just, it's very bizarre, but that's how much the stigma is with mental health of, well, I'm the provider, I shouldn't have any of those issues. Well, there's no shame in having those issues. Something horrific happens and your body responds. And so there's the physical aspects, there's the relational aspects. I mean, there's so many different dimensions to a human rather than just one or two. And so if you neglect to focus on the others, you're not going to experience the full healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so an example would be, so in the book, there's various stories of people who have experienced traumas and found healing through it. But a physical barrier could be chronic pain. But the chronic pain could also lead to an addiction of opiates or things like that, other things that, as you're dealing with the chronic pain and you're not able to do the things that you could do in life, you develop more psychological wounds, you develop more relational wounds. Maybe the friends that you had before where you did certain activities with, you can't do them with them anymore. So it just keeps piling and piling on. And so it's not just the physical pain anymore, there's all kinds of other barriers. And so it's not just dealing with one barrier, but it's just seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's like a domino effect almost. One thing begins to impact the other thing, which can feel, I know for myself, I'm super open about my struggle with both depression and anxiety. It can feel frustrating because it's like you deal with one thing, but then you still need to deal with all these other things. And my clients tell me that as well. It's like so overwhelming that I feel like I need to change all these different things. But I also find that as we focus in on maybe one barrier, that it begins to impact the other ones as well. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yes. And I I've seen that example over and over and over again. We have our first program with veterans and first responders is called Tribe, and we have a barriers chart at the very first week. And I have a lot of people say, well, I circle can I circle the
I
whole
got them
chart
all of
because
them.
I've got them all right. But one example is this one person was like, asked me that, can I circle the whole chart? Ends up that the biggest barrier was believing that God was punitive. So believing God was punitive forced this person to have intense, extreme anxiety of messing up and failing every time because it's all on him, because every time anything bad happens, it's his fault. And so really not having a healthy relationship with God, not having a lot of shame all the time. So a lot of those barriers of the barrier chart related to that one barrier. And once he was able to deal with that, a lot of the other barriers just melted away. And so that's the beauty of having a relationship with God, is really being able to go to him and ask, I got all these barriers, I got all these problems, but what do you want me to look at right now? And that's what starts that process of freedom for them.
You've been super open about your healing journey, which I think is so amazing. So I'm curious for you, what was that first barrier of change? What was that first barrier that you began to overcome?
The first barrier, the biggest barrier for me was not being honest with myself. And so it was the person that I was, or that I was trying to portray myself to be to the world and to myself, was not truly me. It was this performance-based, achievement-based, credential-based, and I didn't know that's how I was living. My faith was, I believe that I'm a sinner, and Jesus died to save my sin and gave me that salvation as a free gift, and I put my faith in that. But I wasn't living my faith out that way. I was living my faith out based on trying to earn his favor and be good enough, even though he said I was good enough when he died for me. And so it was this weird dynamic of living out a certain way that was completely hypocritical with my faith and what I truly believed. And so once I was able to face the reality of what I was doing with my life, that's what basically shook my whole world and made me rethink everything that I was doing and how I was living. And it took my world crumbling from the trauma for me to truly see that. And it wasn't just me on my own doing that. God was with me the whole time, and he was loving me through my trauma and darkness. And even when I was at my worst, he was there loving me, and I started to feel it more. I started to truly experience it at a heart level, where I was putting him at arm's distance because I was trying to prove my worth instead of welcoming him and opening up my arms to receive his love.
It's sobering,
so that was the
isn't
biggest
it?
step.
And humbling.
Oh, for sure.
Because you didn't really realize, what I'm hearing you say is, you didn't even realize there was a problem until there was a problem.
Right. Deep down, I knew there was a problem, and I was extremely restless and joyless, and really, I didn't like myself at all. But I didn't acknowledge. I thought that I could push past that and earn favor for me and earn it with God. And it wasn't until there was nothing I could bring to the table, there was nothing I could do, where I realized, wow, like, God doesn't care that I don't have anything right now. He loves me the same. And so that's really what shook my worldview up of what I was living out, is that I don't have to perform to get his favor. I already have his favor because he loves me for me. And so that really helped me move past that and understand more of who God is and the power of his love and grace and forgiveness.
Do you feel like that spirit, overcoming that spiritual barrier is like the most important one to do first, or do you feel like it's really dependent upon the person and the situation?
I think it depends on the person. So, I mean,
Yeah.
if someone has a psychotic break, you have to treat the psychosis before you can they can develop a better understanding and process through things. If someone has an intense trauma, sometimes it takes time for them to learn grounding techniques and things to where they're not so hyper vigilant and hyperactive where they can't process or think clearly. And so if someone has, an addiction where the drug is causing them to not think clearly. So there's everybody's different. I think for me, the the key to my healing was unlocking those spiritual barriers, but it didn't mean that all the other stuff didn't need treatment too. But
Exactly. I
yeah,
love that because as Christians, we can feel like if only we could pray it away. And I think in your instance with the traumatic brain injury, I think that's to me pretty obvious that you just can't like just, snap your fingers and it be over. But I do feel like when it comes to maybe depression, anxiety, like OCD, some things like that, there's still a belief that if only we were to pray harder, that then we would be better.
and I think that with as humans, we try to find a formula. Like
Yeah.
if I fit this, if I do everything in this formula, I will be better. We try to compartmentalize everything, but like everybody has their own journey with God. Everybody has their own story. Everybody has their own problems, and everybody heals in different ways. And that's why I think it is important as clinicians and to really approach each person of where meeting them where they're at and not where you think they should be or where you think or oh, I've seen someone like this before, this is what they did, this is what you do too, and you'll be better. It's
Mm-hmm.
everybody's so different, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's really meeting them at that individual level and that person knowing that we live in a fallen world, we have broken bodies,
Mm-hmm.
but the most important thing is that we have a hope, that we have a plan, a purpose, and an identity, and each person has their own mission, and so that's where a lot of the jealousy and envy can come in, and
Mm-hmm.
constantly comparing ourselves with, oh well, this person had the same thing, and why are they better, and why am I not? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
super easy to get sucked into,
Well, it can
and
feel
so
very confusing because there's like all these like TikTok videos and Instagram posts, and it seems like everyone has the answers. But what you're saying is there's really no clear answer. It's a very slow process.
right, slow process, and it does require looking at the big picture, the physical, the psychological, the relational, the spiritual, and just really having a group of people that can come alongside you and support.
Mm-hmm. What did that look like for you? Because in your journey and in the book, you write about how you were so isolated. You had your mom who was caring for you, but then at one point she left and you can't drive, you can't go anywhere. So what did it look like for you to maybe form your community whenever maybe it felt like you were starting from ground zero?
Part of that was my problem, my doing, because
Yeah.
I have always been, up until my traumatic brain injury, very closed off and guarded, and really not wanting people to know too much. I would only give them the pertinent information. So that's after the traumatic brain injury. Like, I'm very, very vulnerable, very open because I don't have anything to hide anymore. And so that's where the freedom comes in. But dealing with the trauma, so being a person who has this background of I don't want to open up, I don't want anybody knowing my stuff. Going through a trauma makes it a lot worse, and
Mm,
definitely don't want people to know and to share too much. And so a big part of it was my fault of not wanting to open up. I had just moved here about a year prior to the traumatic brain injury, so I hadn't made too many friendships. I had just started going to a new church, and so there wasn't too much of a community that I had. And so, and I had been in the military, just moving around a lot throughout the years, and really not having too many solid, close-knit relationships, because being closed off and just being so focused on schooling and getting work done and doing all of that. So the trauma just compounded it a lot. But as I was able to open up and be myself, then I was able to develop more friendships. And that was a big reason why I created the nonprofit, the Advancing Warriors, was to form a community of people who can be themselves, who don't have to have their guard up, and who can be accepted and loved, and who have a similar, who can relate because of the profession and because of what they've done. And so that kind of builds a deeper bond. So really building that community out was really big for me. So it helped me a lot on top of helping other people.
You're able to maybe model it as you were trying to create that model for them.
Right.
It's,
Right.
again,
And that
very
transparency.
humbling.
Yeah. That transparency is, I think, is the key, because if I'm open and honest with everything that I did or that has been done to me, or like, I can't judge anyone. And so their guard falls because they don't feel judged. They don't feel like they're going to be scrutinized, and really seeing that breaking through the barrier of God is punitive. Well, if they believe God is punitive, they probably believe people are punitive. And so it's that fear of making a mistake, messing up, and not allowing people to see any darkness within them because they're going to be rejected.
Yeah. There's so much to the healing journey. And I feel like that is what can be so overwhelming. And when we're isolated, it just makes it a million billion times harder. And then I feel like that just is like a door wide open for shame.
For sure. And that constant fear that if I do step out in another relationship, I'm going to get burned.
Yeah.
And so that was another piece to my freedom and healing, was seeing that following God and having him at my side, knowing that I have his love no matter what, that he holds the key to my heart. He has all of these, he meets all my desires, that no matter what path I go down, if another trauma is going to happen, he'll bring more and more of his love and grace to me to cover me in that trauma. And so it was this shift of, and it took a while. It probably took like 4 years after to really get to the point where I wasn't living in fear of another trauma that was going to happen. And so that fear prevented me from relationships, prevented me from doing things, going out and meeting new people, because I thought, well, what's the point? Because if I do, I'm going to get burned. I'm going to get hurt. And so God really helped me see that hurt and trauma has no power over God, that God is so much more powerful and loving and gracious, that he can bring deeper healing through the next trauma that happens. And it's not that I want another trauma to happen, but
totally.
I don't have that intense fear.
You're done. You've had plenty.
Right. I'm good.
That card is full.
Right.
But I what you're saying really resonates. And I love The Body Keeps the Score. I feel like that book has really, I think, shifted the way that we see trauma, because our bodies store memories at a cellular level. And so we may not even realize, well, I'm in a new small group and I am scared. But we can notice that our body is maybe feeling tense, or our heart is beating fast. And so I think it's just so interesting when we look at trauma from a physical perspective. It's not only our mind that needs to change, our heart that needs to change, but also understanding that at a physical level, that our bodies have changed.
And I experience a lot of that. So people who have sexual trauma typically have a lot of chronic pain issues. And they've actually found that self-defense classes can improve that chronic pain. because they feel more empowered to take care of themselves and to guard
Mhm.
themselves against a future attack or something like that if it would happen again. And so my whole body just would spasm up, and it was almost like I couldn't move. And it wasn't an overnight thing where that healed, but it was just layer after layer of all of this stress and all of this trauma, and the spiritual aspects, the physical aspects, the relational aspects. It's really, as each one was, I chipped away at each one, chronic pain got better. And
Mhm.
so it's amazing how your body responds to something. It could be spiritual, could be psychological, or it could be a relational betrayal. And that's how, like, your body isn't isolated from everything else.
Mhm. It's all connected.
Hmm.
And learning that connection is really empowering, but it can feel very confusing. I know for me, and I'm sure for you and the patients you work with, the clients I work with, it can feel that oftentimes I'll be like, well, how long is this going to take? You know what I mean?
Right.
What are we looking at here? And I think the hard part is that healing isn't a linear process, or it's full of twists and turns. Can you speak into that, of the fact of, it really does kind of go here and there and down and up, and it's not just a straight shot to you getting better.
Right. I think a lot of people have that misconception that, oh, well, I just take a pill and I'm good. Just give me a
Mm-hmm.
pill and I'll be fine. Or, if I just go through this therapy, then I'll be good on the other end. And then the biggest issue is when they have a setback or they're not where they want. It makes it even worse, and it brings on that shame of, wow, I really haven't had any healing at all.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm worse than I was before. And so it's really hard for people to see the incremental amounts of healing. But looking back, say, a year ago, as opposed to a day ago, it's easier to see the change.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we don't live in a petri dish. We don't live in isolation to where we can avoid all traumas, all triggers, all stressors. And so I like to help people see that if you have a perceived setback or a trigger, it's just your body's ready to start dealing with that piece. And if you
Mm.
lean into, okay, let me have that curiosity, as you said earlier, as to why I'm reacting to this, instead of having fear of it, leaning in and saying, okay, what's underneath this? An example, and I have it in my book, with olfactory sense can be a major trigger for trauma. And so one of the major triggers for me was the smell of bacon and sausage. And so I had this intense reaction out of nowhere where I thought, well, I thought I found healing, and now I have this intense anger. But when I dug into that and had an understanding of why that was going on, then it didn't have the same power over me before.
Mm-hmm.
Had I just been extremely frustrated and just say, well, I give up because I'm not healing, I'm still having these triggers and reactions, then I wouldn't have that healing. I wouldn't have dug in and really explored that to lessen its power over me. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think people can have that knee-jerk reaction of, oh, well, I have a setback or I have a trigger, I'm done. Versus I have a perceived setback or a trigger. Maybe that's actually time for me to explore this and see
Mm-hmm.
if there's anything underneath that I can heal from, instead of just being overly frustrated with it.
Mm-hmm. That's such a freeing way of looking at it. I'm triggered, therefore there's something there.
Right,
I can look into it versus like it's time to give up. And
right.
I like that analogy in the picture of the onion, because there's sometimes where we can get to the end of one journey and have a period of peace and calm, and then something happens, and then it takes us to a deeper level of our heart. And then as we
Mm-hmm.
find out, it's not just this one thing, but actually it's childhood wounds or this other trauma that we didn't even realize that we had, or we had been minimizing that. And so it really is an ongoing healing journey, which is why I try and be so open about it, because it's not just like a one and done thing. You go to counseling one time or treatment one time. It's an ongoing process.
Right. And there are things that I've learned, and some of them are just last year, learning things that are extremely powerful and important that I wish I had done 20 years ago. And it's as simple as when you feel triggered or when you feel activated or revved up or extremely angry, it's going to God with that and sitting with with him in that emotion and asking him, what's going on here? Why am I having this intense reaction? And he shows me. I have childhood things that pop up in my head that I'm like, wow, I didn't think that was still bothering me, or I didn't think that was a problem. And so the more I do that, the more I grow and transform and heal, and I'm not triggered in the same ways anymore. And so there's just a lot of different levels and layers, and really finding more and more freedom. But it does take some painful experiences and some suffering, and really wrestling with things and being honest with ourselves. And when we put in that work, we're richly rewarded for it.
It's totally worth it. I'm like,
Sure.
I wish I could hold up a before and after picture. You know what I mean? But it's not one of those things that you can see always on the outside. It's such an inner work, and it's so worth it. In the book, you write about the importance of self-awareness and self-compassion as being two catalysts for change to overcome those barriers. Talk to us quickly about how are those two things so crucial in our healing journey through trauma?
Especially in our society, there's all kinds of triggers, temptations. There's darkness all around us. I mean, I would say everybody at some point is going to experience at least loss, if not several traumas, multiple traumas throughout their lives. Some people, first responders are probably going to experience a lot more, and it's just going to pile on. But if we aren't aware of the traumas and how they're affecting us, then we're never going to, it's almost like stunting our growth emotionally and spiritually, because we're stuck in that stage, that developmental stage of trauma, to where we can't ever get past it unless we deal with it. And it's not going to go away. Like in the body keeps a score, it's stored. Unless you deal with it and process it, it's stuck there. And I have a lot of veterans who are in the Vietnam War who they don't want to let Pandora out of its box. Well, if you open that up and trust God with it, he does amazing things. And I've seen it. I've seen amazing freedom and transformation. And so it's just recognizing what experiences we go through, how it's affecting us, because if we don't deal with it, it's going to affect those closest to us next. Right. And they're going to have to deal with it. And so that self-awareness is extremely important, recognizing, I mean, King David in the Psalm says, search my heart. That's a requirement for him, because he knows how quickly he can fall. We can quickly fall into darkness. We can quickly fall into slavery, with whether it's addiction or whatever it is. And so it's really recognizing what our vulnerabilities are, what our temptations are, and how we're responding to the things going on around us. And the self-compassion piece is extremely important, because if you don't allow yourself to be loved by others or God, or respect yourself enough to be loved, then it's really hard for you to truly understand what love is.
Yeah.
It's hard for you to love others. It's hard for you to be compassionate or empathetic, because you're constantly blocking that love from entering your heart. And so that was my problem for up until age 30, where it was just this constant desiring to be loved, desiring to be unconditionally loved and accepted, but at the same time blocking it because I'm trying to prove it, trying to prove that I can be loved. And so I was very self-absorbed, and I didn't realize it. I was doing all these things for God, but it was to prove that I was lovable. And deep down, I didn't feel lovable. And so that really blocked my ability to receive God's love, to really draw closer to him, to draw closer to other people, and to truly be myself, because I didn't like myself, and I didn't want to see myself, and I didn't want others to see myself. And really what it was trauma I never dealt with, and that had festered and grown over and over and over the years, that really the enemy was able to plant that lie when I was young, that lasted and just continued to perpetuate. So that was a combination of, once I was self-aware of that, I was able to deal with the self-compassion piece.
It all goes together, doesn't it? Just like the barriers, the points of change all go together as well, including self-care and self-compassion, that awareness,
right?
Community. For the person who is like, knows they have trauma, but hasn't really looked at their trauma, what do you feel like is like a great just starting point for anyone?
I think if they have a relationship with God, the best starting point is just to ask God, and to ask God for his grace, to ask him for wisdom, to ask him to bring someone into their lives to really help guide them in that, someone that they can trust.
Yeah.
The other piece is really finding someone that they can trust, where they can talk to them about it, because kept in and blocked, like where they haven't even verbalized it, they haven't processed it out loud at all. To have someone that they trust who will show them that empathy and compassion can really soften their heart, to get them to a place where they can open up and they can start dealing with it, and knowing that you don't have to, you can go at your pace. So I have people all the time saying, well, I'm not going to rehash all of my traumas and everything and just spew it out there. It's at your own time, at your own pace, maybe a little step at a time, maybe a little, like I dealt with a trauma when I was 20, and leave it at that. But at least that person knows and can be there for them when they're ready to share more. But just having it, sharing that with one other person can be extremely powerful and empowering for someone who's never really dealt with the traumas. We had, I have someone in my book who kept the traumas in for over 40 years. And he found freedom because he joined a group where he actually could relate to other people, and he started opening up, and that was what gave him an amazing amount of freedom. And so it's really the combination of that community, but also not allowing that trauma to continue to build and fester like cancer, to where it's empowering, or it's overpowering that person, and it's enslaving them. And that's what trauma can do, unless it's exposed, unless it's out there to God, number one, and opening up to God and saying, okay, I'm acknowledging that this is here. I'm acknowledging that this is a problem. What steps do I take? And really having people in their lives that are compassionate, that are empathetic, that aren't judging and aren't shaming, and aren't saying, well, why didn't you do this? Or you should have done this. And really having that space where they can open up. I think that's really important.
Well, this has all been so good. Where can we find you, and where can we get the book?
So you can get the book. It should be Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the retail stores. It will be available on October 4th. I also have books available on my website, drelizabethstevens.com. And then for first responders or veterans, advancingwarriors.org is our website that they can check out what we do for veterans and first responders.
Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing and helping so many underserved communities that we don't always think about. The first responders, we know that veterans have been through things, but we don't always really understand. And so to create a network and a community where they feel so known and understood, I think it's just like so amazing. So I love all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me on here.
Yes, thank you.